I yield the floor.
The senator from Maine.
Before joining Senator Fisher, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that Chris Schweitzer, a military fellow in the office of Senator Pryor, be granted floor privileges for the duration of the calendar year.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Mr. President, it's a pleasure to join the General Senator from Nebraska. I love the idea of the Surf and Turf Caucus as reaching across the country to try to find common sense solutions. I often think about legislation and what we're attempting to do, and this is an attempt to codify common sense, to try to bring to the regulatory process as it deals with medical devices a little more thoughtfulness and cautiousness as it affects health information technology. The first part of the bill actually sets up a process whereby we can examine in a thoughtful kind of way some of these issues to reduce the regulatory burdens, at the same time foster innovation, and very importantly, protect patient safety. Sets up a process involving the National Institute of Standards and Technology and other parts of the administration so that the regulatory process in this area can be rationalized across agencies and better coordinated. The heart of the bill, however, as the Senator just outlined, is our attempt to differentiate between medical software that has a direct impact upon patient health and software which is more peripheral and can range from the app I have on my iPhone, which is a pedometer that tells me how much I've walked each day and how much I should walk each day, or the kind of software that's being developed across the country to assist medical practices in their billing and in the operational part of the medical business. And I think one of the most important points is, as the Senator pointed out, software evolves almost overnight. And if you can go through this burdensome regulatory process, whether it's 60 days, 120 days, or a year, get your software approved, and then you find there's a bug and you have to fix it, that could restart the whole regulatory process. And I think this is a bit of I think we should acknowledge that this is a bit of preemptive legislation because the FDA thus far has not intruded very deeply into this process, but we believe that this is important in order to define the areas where regulation and the protection of patient safety is important, but software that manages the billing process of a medical practice should not fall into that category and should not be subject to that level of regulation. And that's really what we're talking about here. As the Senator mentioned, this law goes back to 1976. And in thinking about 1976, Jerry Ford was president, and software was a mink coat. We weren't really thinking about what we're doing today. And of course the legislation did not anticipate the kind of intense innovation and new thinking that's going on that's able to protect people's health just by giving them information about themselves. I have no doubt that the time will come when a smartphone will be able to do blood pressure or temperature or certainly heart rate. And that's information that we should have ourselves not necessarily regulated by the federal government. So I'm delighted to join the Senator from Nebraska and the Senator from Florida to introduce this piece of legislation. I think it's important. I think it's part of a larger project to try to bring our federal regulatory process into the 21st century, where time is of the essence, innovation is at the speed of light, and that we can't burden our people who are doing those innovations with a lengthy and, yes, expensive process that has a tendency to discriminate against smaller entrepreneurs and business people. So I compliment the Senator from Nebraska for bringing this piece of legislation forward. I'm absolutely delighted to join her in its sponsorship, and I look forward to moving it through the legislative process. There's a companion piece of legislation in the House, And I think this, as I said at the beginning, is an effort to get as close as we can to legislating common sense in this area. And I think it will make a difference for businesses, for people, for patients, and for the health care system in America. I thank the President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, we find ourselves today considering legislation to fix a problem that Congress and the President created only 2 short months ago. We knew from the Ryan Murray spending deal that it cut military pensions. And yet this Senate passed the bill anyway over my objections and those of many of my Republican colleagues. Congressional Democrats insisted on keeping the military pension cuts in the Ryan Murray deal and would not accept change. Every single Democrat supported Majority Leader Reid and rejected amendments to stop the cuts and voted for the final passage. So they ignored the warnings that I and others issued, and virtually every Senate Democrat voted to keep these cuts, rather than close clear federal tax loopholes that allow illegal aliens to gain money improperly. So what happens? Constituents back home were outraged. And now Senate Democrats are trying to claim credit for fixing the very problem they created, which in itself is not bad. But unfortunately, instead of doing this in a good faith way, consistent with our spending priorities and limitations under the Murray-Ryan bill, the prior bill that's before us now authorizes more spending, unpaid for, in direct violation of the spending limits set out in the Ryan Murray legislation passed just a few weeks ago. So we passed legislation, we set limits on spending, and here we are blithely walking in again. So I'm at a loss as to see why my colleagues continue to resist replacing these cuts. Cuts to veterans who've earned it, who've been drawing these benefits, and not replacing them by closing the tax credit loophole for illegal immigrants. It was recommended, this closing of the loophole, by the Inspector General of President Obama's own Treasury Department. Why are there those who continue to be determined to protect billions of dollars in tax fraud and allow it to continue? Would it not be in the national interest to close this loophole, restore these pensions for our veterans, and maintain the savings we promised to the American people? Indeed, the savings would more than pay for the replacement of the veteran retirement provision. It would help reduce our huge deficits in addition. So let's review how we got here. In August of 2011, as we approached the statutory borrowing limit, the debt ceiling, Congress passed the Budget Control Act, which Congress agreed to immediately increase the debt limit by $2.1 trillion, allow us to borrow another $2.1 trillion, but Congress promised to reduce the projected growth of spending from $10 trillion over the next 10 years to $8 trillion over the next 10 years. That was said to be a spending cut, but really a reduction in the growth of spending. So this 2011 legislation passed into law, signed by the President, promised to reduce the growth of spending by $2.1 trillion. Now, I did not support that act. I thought we could have gone more and hoped to do more. And, of course, I recognize that it endangered our military in a disproportionate way, although we hoped it would ultimately be avoided, but it was not. But once that legislation was passed, I felt, and I think most of us in Congress believe, that we should honor the agreement we made to the American people. But almost immediately, many of our colleagues began saying that even those spending reductions were too much. At every turn, the Senate passed or attempted to pass legislation that broke the spending caps. And I raised a number of budget objections. I'm the ranking member on the Senate Budget Committee, and I'm aware when spending violates the spending limits that we have. I have on a number of occasions raised objections or budget points of order, and it takes 60 votes to spend more than the budget allows us to spend. So it gives us a check on spending. Many of my objections were sustained almost entirely with Republican votes, I'll add, but in plain fact, our colleagues were unwilling to save the money they promised the American people. That's what it is. We agreed to save a certain amount of money. We promised to do so. And when things get tight and their political groups want more, we tend to spend more and make excuses and violate the budget. And that, of course, is why we're in this deep, deep financial adverse situation we're in. So Chairman Murray and Chairman Ryan entered into a negotiation to ease the Budget Control Act spending cuts, the sequester. They unveiled a plan which increased spending above the BCA levels in exchange for increased tax collections and some spending cuts. They said it was paid for, the new increases in spending. So the increases in spending happened in 2 years, promised cuts for over a long period in time in the future, but it did in fact balance, as they described it, at the time. But immediately, my staff alerted me to a provision in the bill that proposed cutting military retirement benefits by $6 billion. Not for future recipients, for current soldiers and retirees. Some service members would see a lifetime reduction of $120,000 or more, some $60,000. This was a cost of living reduction of more than 60%. So this, I felt, was unacceptable. There were a lot of other things we ought to be cutting before we cut earned, promised retirement benefits to our veterans who served 20 years. Only those who have a 20-year service record would qualify for this. I thought it was unacceptable and pointed it out. Of course, no one seemed to know where it came from, this provision. The Department of Defense said they weren't consulted. This was not surprising since the legislation was produced by a secret few behind closed doors, not something I think is good process. The traditional legislative conference committee process was abandoned. Well, the good news is that it was caught before it came to the floor, and when the bill came up, some of us offered proposals to fix this problem while staying within the spending caps. So to not cut the veterans $6 billion, we needed to find some other place to cut $6 billion and put it in place of that, else that would at least have kept the promises of the bill sponsors of Ron Murray within their promise. Military retirement cuts were a significant part of paying for this new spending level. So in that spirit, I proposed, I thought, a reasonable alternative. For over 2 years now, I've been trying to close a massive tax loophole. In July of 2011, the Treasury Department, United States Treasury Department, part of President Obama's administration, reported that illegal aliens received more than $4 billion in free child tax credits in just 2010 alone. In some cases, households received tens of thousands of dollars year after year, in many cases claiming as dependents people who don't even live in the United States. A number of these filers had no tax liability. That is, they were paying no tax at all, but they were getting tax credit checks from the federal government. And the Inspector General of the Treasury Department asked Congress to act and close this clear abuse. and it is dramatic, really. What we found was that in 2005, credits claimed under this provision amounted to $924 million, but the Inspector General reported that by 2010, it was $4.2 billion, gone up 4 times in, what, 5, 6 years. Surging program. As word got out that all you had to do was make these claims, nobody checked if the children were in the United States or if there were children at all. And there's no way to check. This is what the Inspector General of the Treasury Department reported in its 2009 report. It's made at least 3 reports on this subject and pointed out the problems we face. And it is not accurate to say that we somehow want to abuse children and deny them support. We're talking about plain fraud and abuse in this system. So this is what the Inspector General said in March of 2009. Legislation should be considered to require a Social Security number in order to be eligible for the additional child tax credit. And that's basically what the amendment I offered, the amendment that Senator Ayotte is now offering, and I co-sponsor with her, would do. Just require you to have a Social Security number before you claim a big check from the United States Treasury. This would be consistent with the requirements that IG said, quote, for the Earned Income Tax Credit. So Americans who file an Earned Income Tax Credit have to have a Social Security number. That's the Earned Income Tax Credit. That's for people who work and receive a low income. The Inspector General goes on. As it now stands, the payment of federal funds through this tax benefit appears to provide an additional incentive for aliens to enter, reside, and work in the United States without authorization. By the way, he said, this would appear to be an additional incentive for people to illegally enter the country, because you can come in unlawfully here and claim credit for children that may not even exist, and if they do, they might be in a foreign country. And it's now running up at the rate of $4 billion plus a year. Remember, over 10 years, the cost of the cut to veterans is only $6 billion. This would more than pay for that, closing this loophole. The Inspector General goes on to say, as far back as 2007, IRS employees responsible for resolving errors on tax returns, including those filed by individuals with an I-10, that's a substitute for a Social Security number, raised concerns to IRS management about its policies for handling errors in I-10 tax returns. These employees stated that management did not take any subsequent action to address their concerns. So the IG said employees complained to management, but management wouldn't do anything about it. So a formal complaint, the Inspector General declares, was subsequently filed with the TIGTA, and it goes on to say in its 2009 report in December, some 6 or 9 months later, this. The volumes of I-10s are growing, increasing the risk that fraudulent tax returns using I-10s could be submitted, close quote. I-10s were issued, the Inspector General says, quote, without sufficient support documentation. A statistical sample of 658 forms selected from 1.5 million applications submitted from January 1st through November 1st, 2008 showed that 78% contained errors, close quote. Inspector General goes on to say, there are no controls to prevent an I-10 from being used by more than one taxpayer on multiple tax returns. Nobody's checking if you use the same I-10 number again, apparently. So they just can file multiple returns. He goes on to say, quote, more than 60,000 I-10s were assigned and used on multiple tax returns processed in calendar year 2008. So more than 60,000 of these numbers issued to individuals were used on more than one tax return. You shouldn't be using them but on one. Goes on to say, quote, in addition, more than 55,000 I-10s were used multiple times on approximately 102,000 tax returns with refunds totaling more than $202 million. These are just the ones that used the number on more than one return. And the report goes on. 97% of supporting identification documents were missing or illegible. 23% of signatures were missing, and 5% had incorrect birth dates. And it goes on, you know. One of the things that's pretty interesting is the news media has dug into this a bit. NBC affiliate in Indianapolis in April of 2012 reported this. An undocumented worker in southern Indiana told Channel 13 investigates just how easy it truly is. He said 4 other illegal immigrants filed tax returns using his address, even though none of them actually lives there. And he said this year those 4 workers filed tax returns claiming 20 children live inside his small trailer home. As a result, the IRS sent the illegal immigrants tax refunds totaling more than $29,000. But none of the 20 children listed as dependents on the tax returns lives in Indiana or even in the United States. No, they don't live here, admitted the undocumented worker. The other kids are in their country of origin, which is Mexico. On July of 2012, they further reported about an IRS officer who complained in South Carolina. This is what they reported. For example, Howard, the IRS officer, received a stack of I-10 applications for dozens of children attending the same school in South Carolina. When he researched that school, he discovered it didn't even exist. When Howard reported the scam to his bosses, he claims his managers ordered him to approve the applications anyway. Inspector General looked into that also, that complaint. Well, this is not good. But taxpayers don't need to be subjected to this kind of fraud and abuse. And we absolutely don't need to be cutting veterans' earned retirement benefits while refusing to take action against such fraud and abuse as identified by our own Treasury Department. So, I offered the amendment to save the soldiers' pensions and pay for it by closing this tax loophole. But the majority leader, supported by his caucus, including the authors of this legislation, I believe, for the most part, blocked the effort. Not once, but twice. So let me make it clear, this bill before us today, because our colleagues are refusing to utilize this possible fraud closing mechanism to save enough money to more than pay for it, will be asking us to violate the fundamental principle of the Ryan-Murray Act. The Ryan-Murray Act promised, yes, we'd spend some more, but that new spending would be paid for by taxes and spending cuts. And one of the spending cuts were the cuts to the veterans. So if you take out the cuts to the veterans, where are you going to get the money to make sure the bill is paid for as promised? That's the question. And we've offered a perfectly reasonable, actually essential, loophole closing mechanism to pay for that and pay even more than that. So let me make it clear. The bill before us today is placing us in a position to choose from allowing an illegality to continue or cutting benefits earned by our veterans. So what we're seeing in an astonishingly cynical move, really, think about it, today is that we would restore the pensions to veterans without paying for it, without admitting a mistake was made and not living up to the plain promises made in the Ryan-Murray bill, which reinforced and repassed spending limitations. Congress passed spending caps in 2011. Ryan-Murray spent more but established higher but clear spending caps also. It reestablished spending caps. Now that prior legislation busts the in-law Ryan-Murray caps. And this is not acceptable. Are we blithely ignoring plain spending limits passed into law just a few weeks ago? Is there no shame, no embarrassment at such a dramatic breach of legal and budgetary spending limits? Plain law? Closing the I-10 tax credit loophole is a no-brainer. Let's stop this abuse and not cut current retirements of our veterans. I hope that we can move forward with the legislation today. I'm uneasy, I'm worried, but let's move forward. Let's bring the bill to the floor. But maybe a compromise that's acceptable can be reached. I certainly think that Senator Ayotte's proposal, the one I've supported, is a perfectly reasonable compromise that ought to have overwhelming support in this body. But if such an amendment of this nature is not accepted to pay for this change, I think the legislation is not going to pass in its current form. It would be a plain violation of the promises we made to limit spending just a few weeks ago. It's the kind of erosion of integrity that leads this country to financial disaster. We're running up too much debt. The Congressional Budget Office Director will testify before the Budget Committee tomorrow, and the presiding officer will be there, I trust. He's an excellent member of that committee. And he's going to tell us that interest on the debt of the United States, which will increase every year for the next 10 years and begin to surge upward in the outer years, the interest on that debt in the 10th year alone would be $890 billion. That is stunning. The Defense Department is just $500 billion. Right now, interest on the debt is about $250 billion. It's going to $900 billion in 10 years. The first money this government will have to pay is the money we pay on our interest on the debt we've run up, $17 trillion, and we're going to add another 7 over the next 10 years according to CBO. So that'll be $24 trillion that we have to pay interest on. And he told us if interest rates go up 1%, it will add $1.5 trillion to the amount of interest we'd pay over the next 10 years. And most people tell us our interest rates are going up. So I guess what I'm saying, colleagues, is we know we face a financial challenge. We know we've got to get spending under control. Ryan-Murray was designed to ease this year's cuts in the Budget Control Act and the sequester, and this was the tightest, toughest year of all. So they eased that, and they said they paid for it with tax increases and spending reductions. We've eliminated, the bill before us would eliminate one of the pay-fors and substitute nothing else, which would mean we'd add another $6 $6 billion to the deficit. That's the path to fiscal irresponsibility and financial danger, and we need to get off of it. I would thank the chair and yield the floor. President, I would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Arkansas.
I understand that we're in a quorum call.
That is correct.
Mr. President, I'd ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection, the quorum call is suspended.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today I rise in support of S. 1963, the Military Pay Restoration Act. Last year, the Senate passed the Bipartisan Budget Act, a bipartisan and bicameral agreement that funded our government, provided stability for our economy, and reduced our deficit by over $22 billion. I think my colleagues and the American people will agree that last year was tough. We saw the delay of the Farm Bill, the government shutdown, the debt ceiling. Needless to say, this budget agreement was a positive step forward. But I'll be the first to admit, and I think I maybe was the first to admit, possibly, that this wasn't perfect, especially when it came to the harmful budget cuts made at the expense of our men and women in uniform. You know, there's no question that we need to cut our spending. I think almost everyone in this chamber agrees with that, and I think so many Americans agree with that. But we must do it responsibly. We can do the things that we all talk about. We can cut waste and fraud and abuse. We can eliminate unnecessary, we can be smart and eliminate things that, again, once we think about and roll up our sleeves and do the hard work we recognize we should do, like eliminate unnecessary government property purchases and maintenance and things like that. And we can also cut out-of-date and inefficient programs. I mean, all those things should be done, but we cannot balance the budget. We cannot balance the budget on the backs of our hardworking military members and their family. You know, we're a free nation today because of the sacrifices that our men and women in uniform have made. They've made those sacrifices for all of us. They've made those for our nation. They made them for the world. They lay their lives on the line for us, oftentimes in faraway places from their homes and their families. So we can live at peace right here at home. Ashley, a soldier's wife from Alma, Arkansas, recently wrote me and she said, quote, "My husband signed up to serve so those who don't want to go wouldn't have to." We've made a commitment to our service members, and we need to honor that commitment today by ensuring that they receive the benefits that they've earned. When Aaron of Lake City, Arkansas, signed up for the Army and deployed to Iraq, he counted on those earned benefits to provide for him and his family. As he wrote me, he said, quote, "I held up my end of the contract, and I believe the government should uphold their end." I agree with Aaron. Singling out our brave service members isn't just unfair, it's wrong. Dwayne in Drasco, Arkansas, who served in the Air Force, said, "I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan many times. I left my wife and 3 kids that depended on me. I fulfilled my obligation." The government must right this wrong and fulfill our obligation to servicemen and members like Dwayne. I've introduced the Military Retirement Pay Restoration Bill, and what that does is it repeals Section 403 of the budget agreement that unfairly reduces the cost of living adjustment benefits for our military retirees under the age of 62 by 1%. And ensure that our future military retirees receive their full retirement pay. Unfortunately, I've heard a lot of back and forth here in the Senate and on the Senate floor about this provision. Instead of working against each other, let's work together to get this done. As President John F. Kennedy said, "Let us not seek the Republican answer or the Democratic answer, but the right answer. Let us not seek to fix the blame for the past. Let us accept our own responsibility for the future." We can fix this. And today we'll take an important step forward in fixing this. I'm proposing a responsible solution here. This bill is something everyone on this floor should be able to support. In fact, I've even heard Speaker Boehner down the hall here urging his colleagues over in the House to consider supporting legislation that would repeal Section 403 of the budget agreement just like mine does, just like ours does. Supporting our men and women in uniform is not a partisan issue. It's an American issue. We've seen 30 of the major veterans groups urge us to fix this. The Air Force Association, the Marine Corps League, the Enlisted Association of the National Guard of the U.S., the Association of the U.S. Navy, the Military Officers Association of America, just to name a few. There's 30 of these organizations who've urged us to fix this. They've told us, quote, "This provision breaks faith with each individual who has faithfully served our nation for over 2 decades in uniform." So let's fix it. Let's restore America's faith in Congress by doing the right thing today. Let's give our soldiers and their families the unwavering support they've given us. Let's just put the partisanship aside and let's pass this bill. Our military members and their families are counting on us. Madam President, with that, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Who will call the roll?
Mr. Alexander.
really lobby on right now are possible cuts that could take effect soon for next year. This is sort of the time of year when the Medicare agency decides what its payment rates are going to be, irrespective of the cuts included in the Affordable Care Act. So that's why you're seeing this sort of flurry of activity right now.
Let's take another one of your calls. Next up is Brenda. She is in Tallahassee, Florida, and on our line for Republicans.
Yes, I'm a senior citizen, and I'm on Medicare Advantage. And I can tell you that from the day one when Obama got in 2008, one of his first speeches was, I am going to get rid of Medicare Advantage. And I'll tell you why. Because it's a good deal for the people, it's a good deal for senior citizens, and Obama wants to make sure that retirees have to work right on into their 80s. This provides more income for all the welfare clients, okay? But I want to tell you, I pay $130 a month through Medicare for my Medicare Advantage. I've had my heart worked on. My heart was worked on prior to being on Medicare Advantage. I was under CHP prior to Medicare Advantage. That was $97,000 worth of work done on my heart. And then, a year ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and that was under the Medicare Advantage. And the Medicare Advantage, my treatments without insurance were $700 for the radiation. After all was said and done, what I owed was my the total amount that was due from me was $3,200, which I paid. That was the out-of-pocket that I was, made to pay. But as I said, Obama and Pelosi and Harry Reid would like to see all the senior citizens just work right up through their death so that we continue paying in through FICA taxes for all the welfare clients that get free Medicaid and free food stamps and free housing and help on their electric bill. And this is where our Obama stands.
I mean, you're hearing reflected there exactly, or partially, the point that insurance companies are making in these ads, which are people who have Medicare Advantage generally like it. It is a pretty popular program. Seniors who get their coverage through Medicare Advantage generally rate the program pretty well, and the point that insurers are making in these ads, like the one we saw before, is that if you cut this program enough, eventually those cuts will trickle down to seniors. So I think that's exactly what the caller is getting at.
In Newberry, North Carolina, Geraldine is on our line for Democrats.
Hi.
Hi there.
Yes, hi. I was calling in about the Affordable Care Act. I tried to apply for it a couple of weeks ago, and they told me that I had to make at least $11,000 before I could even apply for it. Now, I was one of those that was affected by the unemployment shutdown. I had worked for 36 years. I am 59 years old now, and I've been out to look for a job, and I just cannot find one. I tried to get the food stamps, and I was told that I can only get $15 for a whole month. And I just want to know, I mean, I have no income now. And I just sit and wait to see if they're going to put our unemployment back. And after working 36 years, you would think that I could get unemployment at least for a year. Thank you.
Sure. Well, on the health care part of that, this is a real problem that a lot of people across the country are running into. Because of the Supreme Court's decision upholding the Affordable Care Act, there's a big discrepancy among the states about whether they're expanding their Medicaid program. And so you're having some states expand Medicaid, and then Obamacare subsidies kick in on top of that. But in the states that don't expand Medicaid, you have this gap of people who truly are being told that they are too poor to qualify for subsidies that were intended for low-income people. So this is the administration's argument in trying to persuade more governors to accept the Affordable Care Act's Medicaid expansion. So far, that argument's been somewhat successful. I believe the expansion has been accepted in 25 states, but there's obviously still a lot of work to do, and real people do fall into that gap.
Sam, we've had a lot of seniors call in this morning. I'm curious what you think the overall impact of the ACA has been on seniors, if you're looking specifically at that population.
You know, it's probably a little bit too early to tell. There are some reductions in Medicare Advantage, but there are also new benefits added to Medicare. The donut hole that we've heard so much about for so many years in prescription drug coverage is being closed. There's a new benefit for preventive care, cost-free preventive care that's been added, and the lifespan of the program has been extended, as we said earlier. So right now I'd say it looks like a plus, but again, there is an argument to be made that as you reduce these payments, you know, fewer doctors will want to provide fewer services.
Our next caller is Johnny in Albany, Georgia, on our line for Democrats.
Yes, I just wanted to call in and try to talk about Medicare Advantage. In my point of view, Medicare Advantage is another form of welfare, and that's all it is. Because I'm 79 years old, every senior citizen paid the same amount into Social Security program and the Medicare program. And those people who are on Medicare Advantage, that's what they get, an advantage. Okay, they do not have to have a secondary to pay that 20% that Medicare do not cover. Myself, I have to have it because I wouldn't go around saying that I don't like welfare when I was accepting welfare under Medicare Advantage. That's exactly what it is. And the lady from Jacksonville, she's getting welfare. And the lady from North Carolina, she's asking for welfare. So it's just welfare, and that's the way you should explain it. It's welfare.
Well, I mean, Medicare certainly is, you know, in sort of the parlance of government reports, it is an entitlement program. It is something that seniors pay into, and the government also funds. So it's a publicly funded insurance program. You know, and I think that one of the arguments against Medicare Advantage or for Medicare Advantage cuts is, again, a lot of the program's critics feel like it is costing too much, costing extra for pretty much the same care, that it's, you know, in a sense, welfare for insurance companies. Obviously, insurers would reject that assertion, and as the caller said, would point out that Medicare Advantage does offer a lot of benefits that traditional Medicare doesn't.
Sam, your latest article. Welcome back. Our guest for this segment is Susan Ferriccio. She is the Chief Congressional Correspondent for the Washington Examiner. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Great to be here.
So walk us through, what are the major storylines running on Capitol Hill this week?
Well, I think everyone's going to be talking about the debt limit. The Treasury Secretary, Jacob Lew, said that he needs the debt limit to be raised by the end of February, the 27th to be exact. Otherwise, he will run out of ways to fund the government. Our borrowing limit is now at $17.2 trillion, and that's going to need to be raised, he said, by the end of February. So Congress is in this week. The Senate's in all week. The House is in till Wednesday because the Democrats have their annual issues retreat, so they'll adjourn on Wednesday. That's just 3 days. There's no deal yet, so we're going to be all paying very close attention to House Republicans because they run the House, not the Democrats, and they need to come up with a plan to agree amongst themselves on how to raise the debt ceiling and then take up legislation on that. Once they pass it out of the House, the Senate will need to decide whether they agree with that or not. It's run by Democrats, so you're going to have a tricky negotiation there on whether or not they agree to it. After that, the president can sign it. So the debt limit is really the big issue on Capitol Hill this week. It's not expected that the House will come up with a solution by the end of this week. That leaves them with very little time because they're not going to be in session again until February 25th, which is just 2 days before that deadline. So I think the dominating storyline in Congress this week will be the debt ceiling. But there are other issues as well. There are other legislation going on in the House and the Senate, including a bill in the Senate to stop a planned cut to a cost of living adjustment for military retirees. There's been a lot of protest over that. It was something that was agreed to in the bipartisan budget deal that passed earlier this year. I think most legislators want to get rid of it somehow. So the Democrats in the Senate have come up with their own plan. They want to take it up today at around 5:30 with a test vote to see if they can get the 60 votes needed to begin debate on this. It would restore the proposed cuts, but it does not include a way to offset it in the budget. So it would add to the deficit. That means it's less likely that Republicans will support it, so we're not expecting that to pass.
Sticking with the topic of the debt limit for a second, you talked about the House having a really short work week. What are you hearing from House Republicans? I know there are some Republicans in Congress who say no matter what, they're not interested in voting again to raise that debt limit.
Right, and not only are there those who don't want to raise the debt limit because they believe raising the debt limit will hurt the economy in the long run because we're borrowing, and eventually that will take up a lot of our growth. We'll be dealing with just having to pay the bills all the time and not being able to have the economy grow. There's also another group who say if we're going to raise the debt limit, there need to be equal cuts in the budget. And that doesn't look like it's happening right now. Democrats feel like they have the upper hand on this and that they don't want a strings-attached debt limit increase. I actually think what we're going to end up seeing is a bill that passes in the House with Democratic and Republican support. And the people you'll see on that are Republicans who don't want a threatened government shutdown and Democrats who would like to pass a debt limit increase without any so-called strings attached. I think it's headed more in that direction right now because let's think back to October when the Republicans really took a hard line on spending and we ended up with a government shutdown. Well, their numbers really plummeted in the polls. So they are very much aware of the public eye being on them in this situation and taking the blame for even a threatened government shutdown. That gives Democrats a little more leverage in this deal making, which is why I think you may end up seeing potentially a no strings attached or a clean debt limit increase pass bipartisan in the House with Democrats and Republican support. And it may end up being a last-minute thing that happens on February 25th when they get back. It's possible they'll do something this week. Some folks in the leadership tell me that it's not likely they'll do something this week, but it's looking more like potentially a clean debt limit increase.
Our guest for this segment is Susan Ferriccio of the Washington Examiner. If you'd like to join our conversation this morning, Republicans, the number is 202-585-3881. Democrats, 202-585-3880, and Independents, 202-585-3882. Susan, you mentioned that bill that would cut a little bit from the working age pensions of military retirees. Explain to us what we're likely to see in the Senate this evening on that issue.
Right. This is a bill sponsored by Mark Pryor. He's a senator from Arkansas, considered an endangered Democrat in the 2014 election coming up. So this bill would essentially restore those cuts at a cost of about $6 billion. If the cuts were not restored, the COLA, or cost of living adjustment reductions, would amount to about 1%. I've seen some estimates that, say if you were at the rank of captain over your lifetime of retirement, that could cost you $80,000. That's some estimates by some people who oppose the cuts to the COLA. So this bill would restore that money, but again, it doesn't include a way to pay for it. In other words, it would add to the country's deficit. Instead of taking other parts of the budget, cuts elsewhere, or some other way to raise money to pay for that. And that's the bill we'll see on the floor. And the problem with that is, it's, in the Senate, we have the dynamic of 55 democratically controlled votes and 45 Republican-controlled votes. You need 60 votes to clear this test vote, or cloture as they call it. It's looking less likely that you'll see enough Republicans join Democrats to reach that 60-vote threshold, and the reason is that they want to find some way to pay for this. There have been lots of ideas out there by Republicans and Democrats to pay for this legislation. This one includes no pay-fors, as we call it.
All right, let's go to the phones. Our first call is from Elizabeth, Pennsylvania. Harry is on our line for Democrats.
Good morning. I have a question about the extension of the unemployment benefits. What is the holdup? Why? I know we only needed one vote. And I know a lot of people who don't even want to vote Republican anymore because of this. And can you tell me, is there going to be any more talk about the extension of the unemployment benefits? Thank you very much.
Absolutely. There will be. In fact,
I try to come down to the floor every week or so to give voice